Well, you know, it was a lot of community, and looking back over the years, I listened to my mom and dad talk about the community like in the 50s, because we weren't as, and even when I was growing up, we weren't as mobile as we are nowadays. So, you know, my family maybe went to Grand Junction twice a year. Peonia was it. And my folks talk about everybody came to town in the 50s on Saturday night. So there was probably more of a sense of community just because of that, because of have to. And of course, you know, the kids I grew up with here in Peonia, they were either coal miners' kids or ranchers' kids. Predominantly coal miners' kids is who I grew up with. But we weren't mobile. We didn't have communication. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have, you know, a lot of those things. So, and because of almost a have to, I think we probably had more of a sense of community just because of that. Because there wasn't, you didn't pay attention to the outside world. I mean, everything was here. And, you know, in some ways we've lost that. You know, some good, some bad about it. But it was probably a bigger, you know, just sense of community as a whole, rather than now what I see is you've got, you know, almost like little tribes. Then they still are a community, but there's several different communities within one community. And I think at that time it was probably more, you know, all for one, one for all. But just because it had to be. But there was a lot of freedom with that. I mean, you know, we did a lot of ornery stuff when we were growing up that you wouldn't get away with these days. My family came here in 1889, and that was my great-grandfather, and he had 9 kids. And they moved here and purchased 80 acres on Lambert Mesa, and then they started homesteading around that 80 acres. So, but 1889 they moved here. They were going to go to Kelowna. They came from Kansas. He originally was in Illinois, was a Civil War veteran, and they homesteaded in Kansas. Then he came here, and they were going to go to Kelowna, and he came over here on a hunting trip with a German buddy, and decided that this is where he wanted to be. So that's kind of how they ended up here. The deer hunting was good back then too, I guess. So, well, my great grandfather, I think, was just kind of a opportunist, and he saw, you know, an opportunity to get land and take care of the family, and then he also had the boys mainly to do the work, and I think he liked to be important. And in his later years, of course, he had a Civil War pension, and he would take off for the winter and leave the boys here to do the work, and he would go back to Chicago to see relatives and the German culture, or he'd go to the hill country and in Texas for the German culture there, and or he'd go to Arizona, but it was mainly, you know, they talk about tribal influences, but I think the people that immigrated here kind of had that. They wanted to be around people they felt comfortable with, and that originally the Mesa, Lambert Mesa, was called German Mesa, and it was that until World War I, and then because of the anti-German sentiment is when it became Lambert Mesa in place of German Mesa. My grandfather bought the original, or great-grandfather bought the original 80 acres, so that's what they started with. And then they homesteaded around that, and we have purchased some places around that also, but currently we own about 1,050 acres. And a lot of it is just rangeland. That's not all irrigated tillable ground, but that's our ranch. Yeah, and she passed away right around the turn of the century, and I think she probably had diabetes. She was going blind, and so she passed away when the younger of those children were, 9, 10 years old. My grandfather would have been about 20, I think. So, but she was, I think, a very hard worker, and of course, homesteading is a lot tougher route than most people have any realization. I mean, they pretty much tried to grow their own food and relied on hunting, and then they got into livestock, but predominantly I think they lived off of game and what they could grow in gardens. When they first moved here in 1889, they went back to Montrose on provision trips. So, that's 50 miles in a buckboard just to get provisions here. So the railroad didn't come to Peonia until I think 1902. So those first 10, 15 years, this was really remote. Yeah, and it varied. It varied somewhat from family to family. There's a lot of them. They became a working partner in reality. And there wasn't anything that the men did that the women couldn't do too. And when it came to working the cattle or whatever. But for the most part, they cooked and cleaned and took care of the house, and there was always food on the table, and took care of the kids. My mother worked out a little bit. During the fruit season, she would come down to the packing house and help pack fruit, and she did that for her Christmas money, so she could turn around and spend it on, the family. But they were a tough bunch, no question. And you talk to a lot of the old ranch wives, and they not only cooked for just the family, but they always had to have a hot meal for the hired hands during hay season, and a lot of that was over a wood stove during the summertime. Of course, most of the places had almost like two kitchens. They would have a kitchen inside, and then they'd have a cook stove out on like a porch, screened-in porch. That's what they used in the summertime. But it was always a tradition, and up until just the last few years, really. But ranchers always got together and helped each other out too during branding or whatever, haying or whatever. But that was part of going and helping the neighbor, was you got a hot meal at lunch. It was usually better than what you could go to town and buy. But they had it was a hard life for women, I think. I don't deny that a bit, and it took a lot of perseverance and, I guess, a vision of where they wanted out of their family to stay with it, because it was not easy. And then, my father, when he was growing up, and we aren't as isolated as a lot of places, but most of big ranches ended up having a house in town so the kids could go to school during the wintertime. Because, when you're only horseback, Even we're about 4 miles out of town, but that's a pretty good trip in the morning when it's 10 below. My father, now when he was in high school, he stayed out there with my grandfather on the ranch during the wintertime and rode his horse to school, to high school. But before that, when his sisters were older than he was, his mother and he and his sisters lived here in town so they could get their education. And that, if you look back at a lot of these communities on the western slope, and like I say, some of them more isolated than we are, but that was pretty common. I know people my age that still did that, like up at Craig. They lived in town during the wintertime so the kids could go to school. We've been, and I'm the fourth generation, and my son's the fifth. So, but you know, you do what you have to do. My grandfather was, you know, running the ranch during the 20s and 30s, and you know, things were looking pretty good up until World War I. I think he was kind of a mover and a shaker, was kind of a leader among cattlemen, and but I think he felt a lot of discrimination during World War I, and he spoke with a German accent and was embarrassed by that. He told my mother that, and he kind of was ready to give up, but he didn't really know what else to do, so he kept going. And there was pretty lean times, I think, in the 20s and 30s when my father was growing up. And of course, the 30s were extreme drought. 1934 was still the year that they talk about, and we've just now rivaled it here in the last couple of years as far as extreme drought in this part of the United States. So they didn't have much of anything, and but they learned how. They just kept going. They didn't really know what else to do. They did dabble. The family dabbled a little bit in fruit, I think, in the early teens, but between freezes, and that was really not where my grandfather's heart was. His heart was with livestock, so he predominantly became a cattle rancher, and then that was passed on to my dad, and then on to me and my siblings when we came along. But you know, my dad worked in the coal mine in the 70s to try and help pay off debts. I mean, you know, the place has been refinanced more than once, and that's just the way it is. And to do some of the projects that he did, they were big in developing water. They had the previous generation, my grandfather and his brothers, had tried to build a reservoir in Reynolds Creek, and it had breached in a big storm event. And my dad was able to get that done in 1952. So, and that reservoir, actually, the town of Peonia used our water in that reservoir during their water crisis of 2018. So we kind of had a little civic duty there that we helped out, and they continue to look at that as an emergency storage if something were to happen. So they've sold some water to the town of Peonia. Both my grandfather and my dad sold some first degree water to the town of Peonia for their domestic use. I mean, we put our land, my dad put a lot of the land in a conservation easement with, then it was the Division of Wildlife, it's now CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, for deer habitat, winter game range. And so we've done a lot of things trying to make ends meet. And my brother-in-law and I increased the size of the operation mainly through lease ground and try and run more cattle because it's like any business. There's a kind of a line there that economic scale, and so we actually run almost double of what what my father ran, but it's on a lot of it is lease ground because the ground's so expensive. It's pretty hard to pay for it with livestock. So we've gone the route. I did 8 years as a county commissioner here in Delta County. Just got done with that. So that took me off of the ranch payroll. And so we've managed to make things work. And that's my motto is kind of like the Marine Corps motto of, you improvise, you adapt, you overcome. So that's kind of how I was raised, and that's how we continue to sustain ourselves here. So, well, water is the lifeblood. I mean, there's no question about it. This is a semi-arid desert in reality, and it's nothing like the Midwest where they get 35 inches of moisture in a year, and the average moisture for this area in Peonia is about 12. And most of that comes during the winter with snow. So the runoff of that snow in the early spring is predominantly where most of the water comes from. The springs and of course that also comes from the aquifers that are recharged by the snow. So, the water has always been precious to take care of, and the amount of work, when you look back in the 1890s, 80s, 90s, and the amount of work that they did to try and get water to a piece of ground is just incredible. I mean, it's backbreaking work. They didn't have the big machines we have now. They did it by hand, horse-drawn slips, and built some of these reservoirs with horse-drawn scrapers and slips and packing what would be one bucket for a dirt for a excavator. They were packing it several hundred feet trying to make a dam, digging a lot of the ditch by hand. I mean, the physical labor that they did was just incredible. And they just, but they had a vision in mind that they had to have that water to grow anything, which they did. Other than, a lot of this country was predominantly just sagebrush and grass, which is part of why the livestock industry flourished in the 1890s. That's predominantly what was here. They started growing some fruit down here on the river, where the water was close and it wasn't as expensive to get to. But then when they started up on some of the mesas, I mean, the Roeber Ranch, my great-grandfather got a decree out of Minnesota Creek for a half a foot of first degree water. It was filed on in 1883. Well, that took over 6 miles of open ditch that he and his sons dug just to get it to the ranch. So, and they figured out contours and, knew a little bit about surveying to figure out where they needed to go with the ditch so it would flow, but keeping it on grade where it didn't wash, because if it runs too fast downhill, it would take the hillside with it. And they had flumes. Originally they were wooden flumes that went across draws, and then they switched over to tin open flumes and built trestles and suspended them up in the air to run across a deep draw and get them down. And that was just one of many. I mean, all these ditches around here, that's the way they were built. And, there's like 40, I think there's over 40 ditches just here in the Peonia area. So you think about the manpower and labor that it took. And, that's been passed down, is how important that is, because without it, you're not going to grow much. And this is not the climate for that you just put seed in the ground and it grows. Like I say, this area, it was, some of it was settled different than a lot of other areas because of the Ute Treaty. When they removed the Utes, they allowed people to just buy property rather than just homestead it. So you had quite a few smaller places show up, and they were, I refer to them kind of as starvation places because they didn't really have enough land or enough water to do what they were trying to do. And several of those up there is part of what my family bought up. They were 40 acres out in the middle of nowhere, and went ahead and bought those because we kind of surrounded them or whatever. But, it was pretty tough. People it was opportunity, and they sold that, the government sold that ground for $1 an acre. So, they were trying to settle it, but on the other hand, to homestead a piece was 160 acres, but you had to prove up on it and show that you were trying to make it better. And so there was a combination of both that went on here. And because of that, the upper end of this valley got chopped up into smaller parcels than you see in a lot of other places. And then, like I say, it was, as time went on especially, they found it tougher and tougher to try and make a family living on 40 acres or less. So, and most of them, a lot of them during the 20s, 30s, even 40s and 50s, the coal mines only worked in the wintertime because they predominantly were producing coal for heat. So a lot of people worked in the coal mine in the wintertime and farmed, ranched in the summertime. And then as the coal mines changed, especially with UMWA and then the 60s when they were producing a lot of coal for steel manufacturing, then it became more of a year-round job. But you still had a lot of people that did both. This up until just the last few years, really, a lot of people worked in a coal mine and still had a small farm on the side. And they worked in the coal mine for the money.
I know it's a tough one.
That's pretty difficult to try and point to one particular instance. There's so many things. A lot of my experiences of growing up, and probably especially riding range and up in the mountains, and just feeling at home doing that. And that was probably what I loved to do more than anything. Was maybe there was a little bit of the Renaissance mountain man in me, but of being up in the wilderness and just with your animals and then seeing the wild animals and interacting with both. That probably as much of it as anything for me. A lot of the humdrum part of it you learn to tolerate for the special times. But, you know, as far as scenery, you can't beat this area for scenery. I mean, and as far as experiences of seeing things, wildlife and close encounters with bears and everything else, I mean, that all kind of fit into it. And I guess, you know, maybe there's a little romanticism in me that thinks could have been part of that crowd from 100 years ago, you know. But, and then trying to make things better as you go along with that. Well, I think part of it was I've been involved in, you know, kind of, especially with the cattlemen's associations and whatnot, of trying to preserve, I guess, our way of life. And I thought I had something to offer for the county of trying to keep this place somewhat special. So that's probably why I put myself out there. But, and, you know, I don't I don't live for those type of legacies or anything. I did, you know, I served 8 years. I learned a lot, and like with anything, I probably learned more than I gave. But I like to think that they were successful 8 years. We went through quite a transformation in those 8 years, because while I was serving is when we went from 3 coal mines to 1, and question about whether that will even survive. So, you know, on the other hand, I like to think that maybe growing up and being involved in the ranch has helped temper some of the, because we were used to tightening our belt, and that's kind of how we ran the county for several years. There was, you know, you didn't do something that you couldn't afford, and you didn't, you just learned how to get by and improvise and adapt. And that's kind of how we managed to get through it. But, you know, thinking back, probably one of my favorite movies when I was growing up came out in the early 70s. So I was like middle school, was Jeremiah Johnson. You know, everybody dreamed of being like Jeremiah Johnson, the mountain man and hunting. So my friends and I, we spent a lot of time hunting and just being out in the, you know, out in the woods. But fishing, no, there's no question. You know, those, and, you know, you tend to grow apart, but then there's always a part that you always remember too, and you know, and then playing sports together and everything in these small schools, it's almost like, you know, I almost relate it to experiences you hear about with veterans that, you know, gone to war together or whatever. It's almost like a band of brothers, and just those experiences. So don't want to relate too much to that, because I know, you know, those guys that were in combat have a lot a lot different, more of a bonding than we do. But on the other hand, it's similar, I think. And I think that's a lot of what, you know, people talk about the coal mines, and those guys have worked up there. And I worked in the coal mine for a couple of summers when I was going to college. And, you know, what gets the work is not great work. The money's good. You're underground. I mean, it's, you know, it's not great, but it's the other people is where you get through that and like I say, the camaraderie that just goes with that. I think, my dad went to work in the coal mine in the mid-'70s when he was, 50-some years old. And I think at that point in his life, that was something because he had been so, somewhat always on his own. He enjoyed that camaraderie of having other people. And I think, I think he worked in the mine for like 5 years, but I think he really enjoyed that time just for that reason. And